that case. We go back to South and East Asia and look at developments there from where we left off, specifically in India and China, up to about the time of the Mongol invasions, which is where we left off in our discussions of the Arab Muslim world last time. So we carry it on up to the 13th century or so. One of these days I'll learn, I should just put a sticker or a mark on which switch it is. Anyway, so talk about Hinduism and Hindu deities, we'll talk about Buddhism, we'll talk about that individual there atop horseback with a pretty fearsome looking weapon that is Tamerlane. Talk about the city that he rules from, Samarkand, which came up, I think, in the Islam video that we watched. You know I'm going to insist on Google Earthing us there. Speaking of, there's my laser pointer. Look at the map here of main Silk Road routes from Xi'an or Chang'an in China through the desert, through the Taklamakan there, the mountains again. Samarkand is right here in the middle of the stands today, the Central Asian nations like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. Below that, of course, Afghanistan. So first, we pick up with the Kushan Empire, which emerges in the land beyond the Khyber Pass in roughly Afghanistan after the fall of the Mauryan Empire in India. So this would be around 180 BCE. These are people who had been driven out of Northeast Asia by the Xiongnu, who we've talked about in here numerous times. And they take up this sort of ideal spot right in the middle of the Silk Road routes between Rome and Han China. And you may recall from previous discussions of either Rome or Han China, some of the things that are passing along those routes. From the east, things like ivory and indigo and textiles, of course, precious stones, spices, silks, of course, from China. And from Rome, things like wine, perfume, glass, Egyptian cloth, slave. And a lot of silver, because Rome tended to import more than it exported. And so you had to pay for that somehow. But you'll recall from the Trade and Civilization essay that you read, it's not just trade goods that flow along the Silk Road, it's ideas too. And so Buddhism reaches China and takes hold there. It also thrived in the Kushan Kingdom, where the ruler Kanishka was a great patron of Buddhism. And merchants built stupas all along the Silk Road routes, stupas being a little more than signposts, but not much more, dedicated to Buddha. And they donated as well to monasteries, which became, oddly, consumers of luxury goods and were very richly adorned in some cases. Pilgrims also erected and carved statues along the Silk Road routes. Perhaps most spectacularly at Bamiyan, pictured there. This is despite Buddha himself. Siddhartha Gautama had insisted, do not worship me. I am not a deity. I'm not to be worshipped in any way or even perhaps venerated. You know, if anything, we consider him like a bodhisattva, someone who attained wisdom but remained to just help other people attain wisdom. Despite that insistence over time, certain individuals do indeed worship and at least venerate Buddha. And again, the most dramatic examples of this might be the statues at Bamiyan, which you may think, that's pretty cool. That's a giant statue carved into the side of the mountain. I would like to visit that. There's a problem there, though. Do you know why you cannot do that? Because they were destroyed by the Taliban. The Taliban were iconoclastic, deeply intolerant, disturbed. Oh, I say were. The Taliban is still around in Afghanistan. Followers of a dark and violent and intolerant strain of fundamentalist Islam that ruled over Afghanistan for a while in the 1990s. And were responsible. This is going to be super tangential, especially for a World I class, but that was how Osama bin Laden was able to build Al-Qaeda, his terrorist group, because the Taliban in Afghanistan provided him with a safe haven to do that. Anyway, the point is, these great wonders of artistic achievement have since been destroyed, regrettably. I think they're in the process of perhaps being restored, but hell of a thing. You know, typically I can take us right to something, but I'm just going to admit my ignorance here. Advertising, unless it just happens to be snow covered and we're atop the mountain, which is certainly possible. Yeah, so I guess they're trying to restore them, which of course won't be the same, but even so. Just a giant hole now. Anyway. So, the Kushan Kingdom falls around 200 CE. So you're looking at a 300-400 year period spanning the transition from BCE to CE. By the 300s, a new state, though, emerges to the east. So we were just west of the Indus River in the Hindu Kush, the Kushan Kingdom. Over here, the Gupta dynasty emerges in the Ganges River Valley, more in India proper, northern India proper. Under the ruler Samudragupta, it spreads west, though, all the way to the Indus River Valley. And so, once again, we have a singular ruling dynasty connecting the Ganges and Indus River valleys. First since the Mauryan dynasty. And India enters a new classical age. Of course, that area remains a popular trade thoroughfare, and pilgrims came to visit holy sites. And the Gupta rulers owned vast lands and mines and made large profits from controlling that trade. It was a short-lived dynasty, though. By the late 400s, incursions by nomadic armies from the northwest began to take a toll, and the dynasty would soon fall. Well, what's the significance if it was such a short-lived period, and even though we acknowledged it was this brief classical age? Well, Buddhism under the Gupta had undergone a significant change. One thing we can take away. Siddhartha Gautama's teachings had not been written down until many generations after his death. And his philosophy undergoes significant transformation in those years and after. Nirvana became more like the Christian or Islamic heaven and less like the sort of Brahman finite release from the sort of wheel of life, as they would say in Brahmanism. As we said earlier, Buddha himself comes to be revered as divine, despite his insisting otherwise, but evidenced by things like the statues at Vamana. Also, Buddha had insisted that there was no validity to the rigid caste system in India, and that all people were equal, especially in their ability to obtain nirvana. That falls by the wayside. Turns out the caste system was a more enduring institution. Also, Buddhism splits into two schools, two versions of the faith. There's Theravada Buddhism with its emphasis on a strict adherence to moral behavior. Sort of Buddhism as a way of life, like a full-time commitment, which is thought to favor the wealthy because they are the ones who have the time and the money to devote to that strict way of living. If you're not a wealthy person, you spend most of your time getting by. And you're probably a follower of the Mahayana school of Buddhism. And rather than focusing every single day on living this very conservative, monastic, disciplined style of living, you believe that nirvana can be achieved through periodic devotion. And you also believed in the existence, and I mentioned this word earlier, bodhisattvas. These are individuals who had achieved bodhi or wisdom, but elected to remain on earth in order to help others achieve that through devotion. If you're Theravada, you believe only Buddha himself. He was the only bodhisattva. Also, for the Mahayana followers, I mentioned this earlier, nirvana is less like an extinction and more like heaven in the Abrahamic monotheistic religions. Neither school of Buddhism would be able to stem the tide, though, when two new religions come to dominate in this area. Hinduism, which develops from Brahmanism, and of course, the other being Islam. But before we move on, just give you an idea of the realms of the Kushan Empire versus the Gupta dynasty here, which united the Ganges River Valley and the Indus over here. Kushan Empire is more to the northwest, again in modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the like, but extending somewhat into the northern reaches of the subcontinent. Let's talk about Hinduism then. As we've said in here multiple times, it's an outgrowth of Brahmanism that is, of course, then polytheistic, focuses on the principles of karma and dharma. Remember, the dharma is your way or your way of life, depending on your station, not just your caste, but what is your occupation or what is your role in society. And depending on that, there is a way that you should be living, a path you should be following. And how well you do that determines your karma, and your karma determines your status when you're reincarnated. And the possibility of you eventually being released from the wheel of life and achieving union with the great Creator. And speaking of which, though it is polytheistic in Hinduism, there are sort of some more important select few gods, specifically Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, who's pictured there, Shiva. Krishna, we have talked about in here before. And Krishna has many avatars, could appear, could manifest as many different sub-gods, if you will. But the big three are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, who represent the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer, respectively. Brahma, creator; Vishnu, preserver; Shiva, destroyer. And I'm sorry, I should specify that Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. There are some very important differences between Brahmanism and what becomes Hinduism, including an increased focus on what they call bhakti, which would represent devotion and rituals, which anyone theoretically could perform. In fact, you yourself could drive today to Lilburn, Georgia, to the Baps Swaminarayan Mandir in Lilburn, Georgia. Very impressive. You can go in there, and there are certain rituals that they will allow you to actually participate in and perform, like pouring water over certain icons, for example, or making offerings to various deities, and singing hymns and other rituals. If you've never been there and you didn't know it was there, and you're just driving along down Lawrenceville Highway, you'd probably be pretty surprised to come upon this elaborate, amazingly beautiful, very, very large Hindu temple in the middle of suburban Lilburn. But they have a little store there too that sells like healthy snacks and stuff. It's really cool. I say you can go there, you cannot. Of course, because of COVID, it is temporarily closed. But in any case, let's have a look. That's not a good angle. You can't really see it unless you get into the entrance, maybe. Okay, well, in that case, there are pictures. There we go. Not what you would expect in Lilburn, Georgia, probably. I think you're not supposed to take pictures inside, but I would be willing to bet that somebody did. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Let's have a look, though, again from this side view. There we go. That's a great shot there.
Beautiful.
It really is. You know, a lot of Hindu art, including the architecture, is very, very elaborate, right? Everything is very finely adorned. And that goes for the inside, too. And it's all very solemn, of course, as you might imagine. You got to take your shoes off and that kind of thing. Okay, so these are not from the inside. That makes sense. People were being good and not doing what they were not supposed to do. Maybe. Yeah, okay. Well, keep thinking somebody was naughty and they didn't put you inside, but maybe not. You know. That's not what I intended to do. Okay. Let's see. BAPS is an acronym, by the way, and I don't remember what it stands for, but we'll look. It's a particular sect of Hinduism. That's pretty cool. I don't even remember that. It's been a while since I was there, in fairness. There's some shots from the interior. Remember that? There we go. Right? It's amazing. And all along the sides there are these little windows, little closet-type spaces that are dedicated to specific gods, and there are offerings made there for them. It's really impressive. Things very fine. I'll give you an idea there. It almost looks like the Arabic inscriptions somewhere like the Alhambra. That's cool. Yeah. There's a random guy. Another random guy. Wow, look at that one.
Peacock.
Yeah, right. Apropos of all these colors. That's a New Year's celebration, apparently. Hello, sir. Just trying to see if I can get one more of that interior area of the temple where the little shrines are for all the gods.
It's so pretty all lit up like that.
I know, it really is. So anyway, when things open back up, there's a day trip for you. It's not that far from here. Certainly not far from me where I am. All right, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we get one. But you get the other. So, I mean, just imagine if that's what's in Wilburn, Georgia, you can imagine what's in actually in India. And so Hinduism, needless to say, is destined to become one of the two great religions of the Indian subcontinent. And the other is, as I mentioned before, Islam, which reached India in 711 as Muslim forces took revenge for attacks on their ships in the Indian Ocean. Pirates from India had been attacking and preying on Arab Muslim shipping in the Indian Ocean, and they decided to take that fight on land, moved into the north and into Punjab in the northwest from there, but went no farther for some centuries. It was not until the late 900s that Turkic-speaking slaves in the Persian Samanid kingdom seized power there, to the west, of course, and founded the state of Ghazni, that Islamic armies would turn their attention on expansion in India. The Muslim ruler Mahmud of Ghazni extends his empire from Persia east into Punjab and down to the Indian Ocean, raiding Hindu kingdoms and principalities to the east towards the Ganges and into the south towards the Deccan Plateau. He met with some resistance from the Rajputs, or the aristocratic Hindu clans of the region. They resisted Mahmud of Ghazni's advances, but they were eventually outclassed militarily. Their infantry, the Rajputs' infantry, was supported by war elephants, which are fearsome and impressive, but you'll recall, even from our discussions of the armies of Hannibal from Carthage, they're not really all that effective necessarily. Of course, Hannibal had some logistical issues to deal with them, but the issue here is that the Arab armies, of course, as all early century Arab armies were essentially cavalry armies. I mean, that's the main element of their force, and I mean, they can run all around these slow, prodding elephants, right? And this is one major advantage that the armies of Ghazni have over these Rajput clans. Now, the Ghazni Empire declined after Mahmud's death, so this is another short-lived empire that presages, though, a much bigger threat to come, of course, in the form of the Mongols. But first, another very brief period of rule for the Delhi Sultan is a Turkish occupation of India, same as with Ghazni. And yet another brief connection of the Indus and Ganges river valleys and the Deccan Plateau that in the long run fails to fully exploit the collapse of Ghazni because it was preoccupied immediately with the Mongols. So what may have been with the Delhi Sultanate would not be known because it eventually falls, as does pretty much the entirety of the Asian continent, to the Mongols, who under Genghis Khan not only toppled the Delhi Sultanate but sacked Abbasid Baghdad, as you know, in 1250, destroying much of that city. They occupied the Punjab region. I say they toppled the Delhi Sultanate. It's actually not. I think the Delhi Sultanate actually holds out, but they are reduced dramatically territorially by raids and gains of the Mongol armies, who did not, though, stop and stay and carried on into the west towards the much bigger prize that was Baghdad and up to the north to Russia, right? And of course, had already run roughshod over China. The Muslim conquerors, let me see if I'm not getting ahead of myself just a little bit. They typically tolerated the practice of Hinduism, though it was totally alien and in fact completely repugnant to them in a variety of ways. Of course, this is in those realms that were not conquered by the Mongols, of course, where non-Muslims had to pay a tax and Hindus could convert and avoid the tax. But a great animosity develops, and this is the point here in terms of Islam versus Hinduism. These two religions are, of course, very, very different. And it's not just polytheism versus the monotheism of the Muslims. But consider that Hinduism, connected as it was to the Indian caste system, is hierarchical. Whereas in theory, if not always in practice, Islam is a very egalitarian religion. And equality of believers is a fundamental tenet within Islam. It's one of the things that made it so attractive to people. Consider in Hinduism there is an elite priestly class of individuals, whereas there are no priests in Islam. In some forms of Islam, there would be imams, but it's not exactly the same thing. More popularly, you consider things like Muslims have a great taste for beef, and of course, cows are sacred in Hinduism. That doesn't square up very well. A lot of Hindu art is very sort of overtly sexual, which would be abhorrent to more conservative Muslims. The very frankness of it, and so on. So, anybody who is going to unite, from this point forward, here's the takeaway. If anybody was going to unite India under one rule, and I mentioned the Mongols don't do it because they've got bigger fish to fry, so to speak. They're bigger prizes to the west. But if anyone would subsequently do that, as we will eventually see with the Mughals, not the Mongols, but the Mughals, you're going to have a big challenge in reconciling the differences between these two, because neither one is going away. And India to this day has a lot of Hindus and a lot of Muslims, although if you take my World II, we talk about the independence of India from Britain, which when it was achieved led to the creation of not one but two independent nation states. One more Hindu, India, and the other more Muslim, Pakistan. And eventually Bangladesh too. So that being said, it's not like every single Muslim migrated to Pakistan or Bangladesh and every single Hindu stayed in India. So point being, any rulers of India from this point forward will have reconciliation to do between the followers of these two very, very different religions. Now let us move on to Tamerlane. I reiterated that the Mongols didn't fully topple the Delhi Sultanate, but it was weakened enough that by around the 1300s it does fall. and is replaced by yet another short-lived empire, the Tughluq dynasty, which itself was subject to raids from the north from Tamerlane, the ruler of a splinter Mongol Khanate to the north. We'll see that the Mongols build this massive great empire, but kind of like with Alexander, that upon the death of the early Mongol rulers, Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, it splits up into various khanates similar to the Hellenistic kingdoms. And Tamerlane was the ruler of one of those khanates north of the mountains, the Hindu Kush, up in the Central Asian region where Samarkand is, which we looked at the very beginning. That's in modern-day Uzbekistan. Was a very important stop along the Silk Road. Had once been occupied, speaking of Alexander, by Alexander, and was briefly a part of the Abbasid Caliphate realms, before becoming the heart of Tamerlane's Timurid Empire, where there is, shortly after Tamerlane's time, but a great madrasa is built there, an Islamic university, center of learning, called the Registan, pictured there at bottom left. Which is a great example of sort of blending of elements of Islamic architecture that we have seen up to this point, and also elaborate Persian adornment. Persian art and architecture, like that of Hindu architecture we're just looking at, could be very, very elaborate and finely adorned. Let's fly then from Lilburn to Uzbekistan. There it is. Made it easy on me. Just appeared out of nowhere. Pretty impressive, right? 3 buildings, all very elaborate. Kind of a cloudy day, which doesn't help, but let's see. Inside one of the courtyards. You see that blue a lot in Persian architecture, that very, very vibrant blue. Hi, folks. Oops. One of these days I'm going to bring a mouse pad in here. Yeah, see, there it is again. Not sure how, oh, I see. Well, aren't you clever, fella? Oh, wow.
It's a great view.
It really is. Good on that guy. Beautiful.
It's so intricate.
I know. That's a great word for it. It's very, very intricate indeed.
So how long would it take to construct something like that?
I mean, great question. I mean, you're talking months and months, if not probably years, in terms of adding all the elaborate finery and adornment and intricacies and whatnot on top of just the building project itself. And I mean, obviously it speaks to advanced culture, but also, just like at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about the pyramids, it speaks to the power and the wealth of the ruler too, right?
Yeah.
To be able to command the labor and the sort of skilled labor that it would take to design this architecturally, to provide the adornments and the pigmentation and that kind of thing.
Also kind of reminiscent of the terracotta warriors.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in terms of how you could, yes, command, not just sort of hard labor, but also very, very skilled labor as well. Although at least in this case, you know, if something's going to be, as they said in that documentary, ruinously expensive, at least in this case, it was for the furtherance of the knowledge and the faith, and not just for your own personal soul in the afterlife.
It's so amazing to think that they did that without like cranes.
I know, it really is. I mean, I knowing nothing of building science, I wouldn't even know where to start. With today's advancements in heavy machinery and whatnot, and you imagine they were doing this, you know, hundreds of years ago. It's very impressive, and it's still vast.
You're not typing.
Thank you. That's the kind of thing you do when you're 40.
Wait, you go from 39 to 40 and like forget everything.
Yeah, instantly these things start happening, right? Yeah. Oh, 61,000 photos. Well, that's that could keep you occupied for a while. Some of these we're just seeing.
Now, what is that blue? Where does that come from?
You know, if you'd asked me that a couple of weeks ago, it would have been on my mind, and I could have told you, because there are, well, I mean, we watched that video, right? And they talked about,
It's called like China blue or something.
we had Chinese purple,
Chinese
yeah, and Egyptian blue, right? And that some of these pigments were sort of unique in time and place, and just oddly, just very oddly, had this discussion with one of my bandmates the other day that LED lights, like they didn't develop each color all at once. Like it took like a lot longer to get LED blue than it did white or amber or whatever, which is, I haven't had physics in 20 years, and so that's completely over my head. But it was interesting to know that like it was the blue that was the difficult one to figure out. Anyway, so Samarkand, an interesting city to me because it's not one that I think most people are familiar with, but it was such an important city there, right in the middle of sort of everything. Certainly so in the time of Tamerlane. Who himself, by the way, was the son-in-law of Genghis Khan and was of not just fully Mongolian but Turco-Mongolian heritage. Of course, he converted to Islam, or otherwise he wouldn't be seeing the patronage that we see here that ultimately leads to the building of the Registan. He had seized power in Samarkand in 1369. He actually, in the 1380s, takes the city of Baghdad and even moves into Anatolia, the peninsula where Turkey is, Asia Minor. Briefly defeated the Ottoman Turks, who we're going to talk about at length later. He attacked the Tughlaq dynasty in northern India, and as part of that attack actually massacred some like 100,000 people at Delhi, and died on campaign shortly thereafter. His empire, though, did last another 100 years after his death, until 1507. And in the middle there is actually a tomb to one of the Tughlaq dynasty rulers. That's Tamerlane himself, of course, to the right. Let's shift gears, though, and move east to China for the remainder of the time. When last we left China, we were talking about the Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty collapses in the early 200s CE, and China entered a period of 300 years or so of chaos and civil war. Not dissimilar from that early warring states period. But China would not be reunified again until 581, when the Sui Dynasty was founded. The first ruler of which, sitting at Chang'an, is Sui Wendi. By this time, Buddhism had spread into China, missionaries and merchants along the Silk Road routes. And Sui Wendi makes it, along with Taoism, state-sponsored religions, founding monasteries, appointing monks, Buddhist monks, as key advisors, and so on. He oversees a great canal project connecting Chang'an with the confluence of the Yellow and Wei rivers. A project which his son, Sui Yangdi, extended dramatically and will oversee the completion of what becomes the Great Canal, which connects China's two great rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze. Over 1,400 miles, the Great Canal, that facilitates bringing rice up from the south to the population centers of the north, including Chang'an. Also facilitates communications, troop dispatches, inspections of the empire, and so on. Regrettably, though, Sui Yangdi also happened to be a tyrant who would do things like put people to death for not having enough provisions when his inspection teams arrived up and down the canal. And also, he led nonstop military campaigns, most especially an unsuccessful one in Korea, that were not only unsuccessful but highly unpopular. And he is eventually killed by one of his generals, Li Yuan, who founds a new dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, 618. A dynasty that would last for nearly 300 years. Li Yuan's son rules as the Emperor Tang Taisong, who oversees a dramatic internal revival and expansion of the empire. A dramatic expansion of the empire, in fact. The Tang conquered the rugged and mountainous regions to the north and west of Chang'an. And in fact, a vast area that would become a province of Xinjiang. You see bulleted there, second major bullet. Further to the south of Xinjiang, they conquered the vast Tibetan plateau that lies between the Taklamakan Desert and Xinjiang and the Himalayan mountains. It is the highest region on Earth, the largest plateau on Earth, and comprises the headwaters of not one great river, but consider all of these: the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Indus and Ganges rivers, and a river we haven't talked about that runs through Southeast Asia and through modern-day Vietnam, the Mekong River. All of them have headwaters of the Tibetan Plateau. We have talked in here before about the Himalayan mountains, the tallest mountains on Earth, including Mount Everest. So if you recall where those are, to the north of India, separating India from China, this is on the other side of the mountains. This is the Tibetan Plateau, right? So Indian subcontinent, Himalayan mountains, Hindu Kush up here, Karakoram mountains. You get over all those mountains. Between that, and look, you can see the Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang very, very clearly. So these are the two vast regions that separate China proper from Central Asia and where the stands are, right? And it's not until the Tang Dynasty that any imperial rulers could lay any kind of claim to those two vast regions, which are, of course, still part of China today. Infamously so in the case of Xinjiang, because that's where the Muslim Uyghur people are that are being indoctrinated, imprisoned, otherwise persecuted by the Chinese Communist government today. So you would sometimes in the news hear what's going on out in Xinjiang province. The Tang also conquered the southern territories below the Yangtze towards Southeast Asia, like we were just talking about, the Mekong River Valley. establishing tributary relationships with Southeast Asia. At the same time, establishing tributary relationships with Korea and Japan. So you got tribute coming in from those two places. You got it coming from Vietnam in the form of trade goods or slaves, somewhat analogous to the situation we saw with the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. In the case of Korea and Japan, too, this would be a period of significant cultural borrowing from China. A lot of Korean and Japanese institutions and elements of their culture are borrowed from the Chinese. Speaking of which, Chinese culture flourished under the Tang, especially poetry and sculpture, partly due to the Buddhist influence. There were Buddhist monasteries popping up everywhere and monks serving as advisors to the Tang emperors. The city of Chang'an becomes possibly the greatest and most cosmopolitan city in the world at that time, with perhaps as many as 2 million people. Of course, markets with goods from all over the known world, to the west and to the south. And the Tang were ultimately undone, as many other dynasties, by border nomad issues. There's a special threat from the Khitan peoples to the north, and to the west, there are the Uyghurs that I just mentioned. And there are the Kyrgyz people, for whom Kyrgyzstan is today named. And so the Tang Dynasty decides that it would behoove them to try to exploit the differences between these people and kind of pick one to align themselves with, maybe against the others. They ultimately chose the Uyghurs, which backfires when the Uyghurs were defeated by the Kyrgyz people and then turned on the Tang. So, long story short, they picked the wrong border nomads to align themselves with. And this will not be the last time we see something like that happen. This is at a time when the Tang Dynasty was already weakened by the same things we see every single time we're talking about the decline of an empire: internal intrigues, palace intrigues, and corruption, and ineffective rulers, the typical dynasty killers. And this brings about another period of foreign invasion and division in the early to mid-900s, which will come to an end when the Song Dynasty is proclaimed. First ruler of which is Song Tai-su, who succeeds in either co-opting or buying off his many enemies and various military commanders, and is able to proclaim this new dynasty, but not with the sort of territorial reach of the Tang. The Song were never able to regain control of Xinjiang or the Tibetan Plateau. The threat from the Khitan peoples remains. They are forced to move the capital from Chang'an further south. Twice, in fact. That being said, even though they don't achieve the territorial greatness of the Tang, Chinese culture and the Chinese economy do flourish under the Song. And one of the significant aspects of that is, after the Tang experiments with Buddhism, the Song fully embrace, you might say re-embrace, age-old Confucianism. Confucianism is back. And along with it, that civil service examination system that you'll recall from dynasties before. That education and examination system that was used to staff the imperial bureaucracy. So a true return to meritocracy. In fact, the Song will ban or bar the sons and relatives of imperial officials and eunuchs from, well, eunuchs clearly didn't have sons. But point being, they are barring these elites from dominating the exams and instead going out and administering the exams out in the provinces at the lower levels. And so this is a genuinely meritocratic form, unlike the sort of pseudo-meritocratic versions of the civil service examination system that we saw in previous dynasties. And you'll recall that young men spent their lives studying the Confucian classics and various other areas of learning and taking these exams, and if they competed and excelled at every level of these exams, and at the imperial level, they might even get very, very high-ranking palace jobs. Or if you didn't do so great even on the first round, that's as far as you made it, you might get a more menial job. But you could rise to the highest positions in central government based on your ability. Now, during the Tang version of this, there were some questions on Buddhist and Taoist text. It wasn't like those were jettisoned completely. But under the Song, these exams become exclusively based on the Confucian classics. And they open up training academies out in the provinces and in the districts to make it a more truly equitable meritocratic system. Now, having stressed that, of course, there was a preponderance of sons of the landed gentry and imperial officials and this kind of thing that could squeeze through and dominate the exams, or maybe not dominate, but be overly represented, just so we don't completely romanticize it as this beautiful example of genuine equitable meritocracy. Having said that, though, it is the most meritocratic administration recruiting system in the world till probably around the 1800s. Under the Song, the population of China reaches some 40 million people, which would make that more than the entire European continent at that time. That said, Song rulers evidently did not learn from the mistakes of the Tang, especially on the frontier. Remember, I mentioned that this was going to happen again. They actually thought they could strike a deal with the Mongols, who, prior to their reign of dominance, were just yet one other border Central Asian horseback riding warlike people. From the Gobi Desert specifically, who emerged around the late 1200s. At the time, Song rulers were more worried about the Jurchen peoples of Manchuria, which is to the north and east as opposed to the north and west. And of course, the Mongols turn out to be the much greater threat, and of course turn on the Song rulers. And will eventually themselves, as we'll see, become the rulers of China. The Mongols not only conquer China, they actually take up the mandate of heaven and proclaim themselves to be now the rightful rulers of China. And we'll talk about that. That will be the Yuan dynasty. Getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but since I mentioned it. So the next lecture will be more focused on China, but we'll tell the tale of the Mongols toppling the Song dynasty, proclaiming themselves to be the Yuan, and then the fall of that dynasty as well, but also we'll look at areas that the Mongols conquered further to the west. All of that next time. Today is Tuesday, so that'll be Thursday. All right, I appreciate it. Thanks for being here, paying attention. We got out early today, so how about that? Not every day that happened, right?